All right, clean freaks. My name's Hank Balch. You're listening to episode 8 of Hank versus the Robot. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about risk assessments in sterile processing. We throw out this term risk assessment. Just do a risk assessment. You need to do a risk assessment. Have you done a risk assessment? And I think a lot of times we kind of assume that people know what we mean. Sometimes we may mean different things depending on who's saying it and what our conceptions are. It's involved in a risk assessment, including if we're speaking to or if we're working with an accreditation agency or any kind of mock surveyors. There's a lot of times this particular topic comes up in sterile processing. It's alluded to in some of our guidelines and standards. So today we're going to talk to our guest in studio, Sterile Simon, about what this actually is, how to do one, answer some of the misconceptions, clear up hopefully some confusion, and get you started on the right track. So without further ado, let's welcome Simon into the studio.
Thanks for having me, Hank. It's great to be here on Hank versus the Robot. Risk assessments are such a hot topic in sterile processing, and you're right, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what they actually entail. I'm excited to dig into this with you today and hopefully give folks some actionable insights. Where would you like to start?
I'm sure you'll do a great job. Let's start with the article that we pulled out of the American Journal of Infection Control, just to kind of set a backdrop of practicality around these risk assessments. So give us an overview of that article in the topics covered, and then we'll dive into defining our terms.
Sure thing, Hank. That article from the American Journal of Infection Control is a great anchor for this discussion. It focuses on the process of troubleshooting failed sterilization loads with a strong emphasis on risk assessment as a practical tool. The authors break down how to identify potential process failures like wet packs or mechanical issues, and then guide readers on assessing the risks these failures pose to patient safety and compliance. One of the key takeaways is that risk assessments aren't just about identifying the problem. They're about systematically analyzing the likelihood and severity of potential outcomes. For example, if you have consistent wet packs, it's not just a machine issue. It's a risk to sterility assurance and surgical site infections. The article also ties risk assessment into compliance, pointing to guidelines like AAMI and how surveyors might approach these scenarios. It's a hands-on approach that aligns well with what we see in real-world sterile processing departments. So it's a solid backdrop for defining what a risk assessment is and why it's so crucial. Where should we go next?
All right, yeah, let's get to some definitions, because even with that explanation, maybe I'm just dense, maybe I am the exception to the rule out there. But these kinds of concepts in particular trip me up because they're kind of abstract. And if you've seen one risk assessment done, that doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the vision or philosophy around them, the structure, the takeaway, the goal. So I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more, stabilizing my understanding here, providing some clear guardrails and roadmaps for what these risk assessments are. So yeah, let's start with a very simple definition of what a risk assessment is, and then let's talk about a couple of examples that would lead you or prompt you to want to begin conducting one, and then we'll talk about the process in a minute.
Absolutely, Hank. Let's break it down nice and simple. At its core, a risk assessment is a structured way of identifying potential hazards or issues, evaluating the likelihood that they will occur, and determining the impact they could have on patient safety, compliance, or operational efficiency. It's basically asking what could go wrong, how bad would it be, and how likely is it to happen? Now, why would you conduct one? Here are a couple of examples. One, consistent wet packs. You notice multiple loads coming out of the sterilizer with wet packs. This could prompt a risk assessment to figure out what's causing the issue, the likelihood of contamination, and the impact on patient safety and compliance. Two, loaner instruments. If a new policy around loaner instrumentation creates workflow bottlenecks or risks incomplete sets, you'd assess the potential for surgical delays, missing instruments, or cross-contamination. These situations scream for a risk assessment because they present both a known issue and a potential for far-reaching consequences. It's all about being proactive, identifying where things might go wrong, and mitigating those risks before they impact outcomes. Should we jump into the step-by-step process next?
Well, before we do that, Simon, address, if you can, the human factors in this risk assessment piece. I think this is an area that I have struggled in the past to get my mind around, because if it's the person conducting the risk assessment that's determining where in our quadrants the risks are, like how likely is the risk, how bad is the risk, it seems just kind of loaded with a lot of potential for like subjective feelings that can be swayed either intentionally or unintentionally, that's going to give us different impacts or results for the risk assessment itself. So I guess, is this a tool we can really trust if it's just based on our feelings?
That's such a great point, Hank, and it's one of the trickiest parts of using risk assessments effectively. Human factors play a huge role because at the end of the day, it's people interpreting data, making judgments, and deciding how to act on those judgments. The subjectivity you mentioned is a real concern, but there are ways to manage it. First, using a standardized framework can help reduce bias. Tools like a risk matrix or scoring system, where you rank the likelihood and severity on a scale, give structure to the process. It's not perfect, but it pushes people to be more consistent and deliberate in their evaluation. Second, involving a diverse group in the assessment adds balance. When multiple perspectives are brought into the conversation, say a sterile processing tech, a manager, and even an infection preventionist, you're less likely to have the results skewed by one person's feelings or blind spots. And finally, anchoring your assessment in data instead of gut instinct is key. If you're looking at things like cycle printouts, testing results, or documented trends, you're building your assessment on facts rather than just impressions. It's not a flawless tool, but when done thoughtfully, a risk assessment can be as objective as the inputs you feed it. Does that help clarify the concern?
It does, yeah. I like your reference there about bringing in that diversity of insight and perspective, especially in kind of feeding into that risk assessment. I also like that standardized approach with data inputs. So it's not just my feelings, it is what the data says. I think that's a very powerful combination, especially if those diverse perspectives are conducting a risk assessment in isolation from one another. So they're not being influenced by what the other person is grading this particular risk likelihood or impact, right? And then they bring it all together at the end and say, okay, if we want to average it, or if we want to talk through and see, hey, maybe you saw something that I didn't see about this particular part of the risk, and now I want to change my assessment of the situation, I think that would be highly productive. Let's move on to the starting process for these risk assessments. Okay, so I've looked at, like, we can say wet packs, or, maybe we're getting a lot of bone debris in our kerosene rongeurs. And I say, okay, enough is enough. I need to figure this thing out. Where do we start? What's step number one?
Step number one, Hank, is data gathering and issue identification. Before you can assess risk, you need a clear and objective understanding of what's happening. In this case, you'd start by documenting the problem systematically. Collect data. Review instrument reprocessing records, inspection logs, and feedback from the OR team to understand how often this issue occurs and under what circumstances. If possible, examine specific instruments to identify patterns, like certain types of procedures or specific cleaning processes. Identify potential root causes. Consider every step in the workflow. Is the issue with pre-cleaning in the OR? Are cleaning protocols or tools inadequate in SPD? Could it be a training gap or even a design flaw in the instruments themselves? Assess initial impact. Determine the known consequences. Bone fragments can compromise patient safety, lead to surgical infections, or flag compliance issues with surveyors. By starting with concrete evidence and observations, you build a foundation for an informed risk assessment. It's all about clarity before jumping to conclusions. Does that give you a clear starting point?
Yeah, as we're looking at the hazards themselves, if I'm a clinician, if I'm a sterile processing leader that's conducting this risk assessment, do I need to be researching external, finding sources to confirm that what I'm saying is a hazard? Or is that stuff that, if it's an internal risk assessment from a hospital, Are my administrators going to trust me as the subject matter expert when I say this is a problem instead of saying, yeah, but where are your sources for this?
That's a fantastic question, Hank. And it really gets to the balance between internal expertise and external validation. In an internal hospital setting, especially for an issue like this, your administrators are likely to respect your expertise as the sterile processing leader. You're the boots on the ground expert in reprocessing workflows, and your insight carries a lot of weight. That said, external sources can be critical for two reasons. One, credibility. If your findings lead to significant changes, like budget requests for better cleaning equipment or overhauling workflows, administrators may want to see evidence that aligns with best practices or industry standards. Guidelines from AME, CDC, or published studies in infection control journals can bolster your recommendations. 2, validation. Sometimes external resources can help you confirm that an issue is genuinely hazardous and not just perceived as one. For instance, if bone fragments left on instruments have documented ties to surgical site infections in the literature, that reinforces your case. So, while you don't need external sources to initiate your risk assessment, having them in your back pocket strengthens your position, especially when presenting findings or securing buy-in. Think of them as your supporting evidence, not your starting point. Does that perspective help?
Yeah, Simon. So we've understood our key areas of risk. We've collected our data. We've identified the hazards. Now what?
Now that you've identified the hazards and collected your data, the next step is risk evaluation and prioritization. This is where you assess each identified hazard to determine its significance and decide which risks need to be addressed first. Here's how you do it. 1, evaluate likelihood and severity. For each hazard, ask, how likely is this to occur again? Rare, occasional, frequent. If it does occur, how severe would the impact be? Minor inconvenience, significant compliance issue, critical patient harm. Use a risk matrix to visually map these factors, assigning a score to each hazard. For example, bone fragments on instruments might score high for both likelihood, if it's happening repeatedly, and severity, patient safety risk. 2, prioritize the risks. Focus on the hazards that land in the high-risk category of your matrix, those with both high likelihood and high severity. These are your top priorities for immediate action. 3, engage stakeholders. Share your findings with key stakeholders, including infection prevention, quality control, and OR leadership. Make sure everyone understands the risks and the rationale behind prioritization. This step ensures that you're not just identifying risks, but creating a roadmap to tackle them systematically. Ready to dive into mitigation strategies?
Yeah, I was hoping that's where we're going to go next. You alluded to the roadmap, and this is where the rubber meets the road. It's a mix of those puns, I guess. So what does this look like when you say mitigation strategies? Kind of define that here first, but then outline what the practical side of that would look like in the scenario that we've presented.
Mitigation strategies are the actions you take to reduce the likelihood of a risk happening or minimize the severity of its impact. Essentially, it's about problem solving to either eliminate the hazard entirely or control it to an acceptable level. In sterile processing, this often means addressing the root causes and implementing safeguards to prevent recurrence. Now, let's apply this practically to your scenario with bone fragments on instruments. 1, root cause mitigation. Training. Ensure staff are trained on proper cleaning techniques, focusing on these specific instruments. Reinforce the importance of visual and tactile inspection. Pre-cleaning, work with OR teams to confirm instruments are being properly prepped and flushed immediately after use. Tools and equipment. Assess whether the department has the right cleaning tools, e.g. ultrasonic cleaners, specialized brushes for these complex instruments. If not, procure what's needed. 2, process improvements. Checkpoints. Add extra inspection steps during manual cleaning to identify and address debris before sterilization. Documentation. Create a tracking system to log when and how cleaning failures occur. Use this data to identify trends and adjust workflows. 3, monitoring and validation. Testing. Implement routine protein and ATP tests on high-risk instruments to confirm cleanliness. Auditing. Conduct regular audits of the cleaning process and staff compliance. 4, communication and collaboration or partnerships. Collaborate with OR teams to align expectations and ensure feedback loops for any issues they encounter. Reporting. Share updates with leadership to maintain accountability and demonstrate progress. Mitigation is where the real improvement happens. By combining targeted training, enhanced processes, and ongoing monitoring, you're not just solving the problem, you're preventing it from reoccurring. Sound like a good plan?
Yeah, one of the things that came to mind here, Simon, as you were talking, is I remember when I was a young sterile processing manager and I had these kinds of projects in front of me, and I'm like, okay, so I'm at the stage and I need to develop what kind of mitigation strategies I want, based out of this. And I had a couple of options in front of me back then, and it was talk to my boss and get insight from her. Try to reach out to my network of other sterile processing leaders, maybe go into LinkedIn and ask some questions about it. But today, the power of AI, you can bring all of your information, all your data, all your steps up to this point, and then give it to someone like you and say, give me some ideas for mitigation strategies that would be most effective, that would address my particular scenario in sterile processing. And then in a few moments, you spit out all these different strategies that then I could pick and choose, I could deploy, I could tweak. I mean, it's a night and day experience to make this so much smoother, and I think even more robust, because then I'm not just dependent on my own brain or my own network. If it's limited, I can access the mind and the insight of all the knowledge base that's built into AIs like this. I think it's a really, really cool, exciting time to be leveraging these kinds of tools in this kind of way. Okay, so we've got the strategies developed to mitigate the risks or the impact of the risks themselves. What's next? I'm assuming there's some kind of monitoring and reassessment that has to happen in this process.
You nailed it, Hank. Once you've implemented those mitigation strategies, the next phase is all about monitoring and reassessment. Risk management isn't a set it and forget it process. It's dynamic. Here's how you keep the momentum going. 1, set metrics for success. Define clear, measurable indicators to track the effectiveness of your strategies. For your bone fragment issue, this could mean monitoring a reduction in the number of contaminated instruments identified post-cleaning, improved compliance with cleaning protocols during audits, positive feedback from the OR regarding instrument cleanliness. 2, routine monitoring. Implement regular checks like ongoing ATP or protein testing on high-risk instruments, observation of cleaning processes to ensure adherence to new protocols, continued feedback loops with OR staff for real-world results. 3, document and report. Keep detailed records of all findings. If things are improving, celebrate and share the success with your team and leadership. If not, these records help identify gaps to address. 4, reassess regularly. Risks evolve and so do processes. Periodically, revisit your risk assessment to ensure it's still relevant. For instance, if new instruments or cleaning technologies are introduced, you might need to adjust your strategies. 5, adapt and refine. Based on your monitoring data, refine your mitigation measures. If something isn't working, don't be afraid to pivot. AI can even help here, analyzing new data to suggest better approaches. This step is what keeps the process alive and ensures continuous improvement. It's how you go from putting out fires to building a culture of excellence in risk management. Ready to tie it all together?
Yes, Simon, I think this is a great place to wrap. Obviously, there is so much more to talk about this. We could do 20-minute episodes on each one of these steps. And depending on audience feedback, we may bring you back and do that here at another date. But yeah, wrap us up, kind of land the plane here, if you will, and tie it together so that we've got a direction to go, for a leader who may be listening to this, never done a risk assessment before, or maybe there's other leaders who are like, oh man, I've been doing them, but I've been doing them all wrong. I've been missing that diversity piece in my risk assessment team. Everyone thinks the same. It's all my technicians. It's all my team. Or I've been missing the data piece. We've been doing this all on how we feel. Give us some closing insights here to kind of turn us all in the right direction.
Absolutely, Hank. Let's land this plane with a clear path forward for leaders at every level. Risk assessments at their heart are about proactive problem solving. They're not just a box to check for compliance. They're a powerful tool for improving safety, efficiency, and outcomes. If you're new to this, or if you've been doing them but feel like you've missed the mark, here's the mindset shift. 1, anchor in structure. A good risk assessment starts with a clear framework. Define your scope, gather data, identify hazards, evaluate risk, and prioritize actions. The structure isn't rigid. It's a guide to keep you focused and consistent. 2, leverage diversity. Bring in perspectives outside your immediate team. Infection preventionists, OR staff, even external advisors can challenge assumptions and provide insights you might not see from inside the SPD bubble. 3, prioritize data over gut instinct. Subjectivity is unavoidable, but it shouldn't drive the process. Collect hard data, reference guidelines, and use objective tools like risk matrices to ensure your assessments are grounded in reality. 4, act, monitor, and adapt. The best risk assessment is worthless if it doesn't lead to action. Implement your strategies, but don't stop there. Monitor their impact, refine as needed, and treat this as a continuous process. And finally, embrace the tools available today, whether that's AI to help generate strategies or technology to track and analyze performance. Leaders who adapt and innovate in their risk management will not only solve today's problems, but build departments that are resilient for tomorrow. Hank, sterile processing isn't just about cleaning instruments, it's about protecting lives. Risk assessments are one of the most powerful ways we can ensure that protection stays solid. Thanks for having me, and I hope this conversation gets folks started on the right path.
Yeah, Simon, terrific job today. I think it's mission accomplished in my book for really bringing this down to the basic level, the foundational pieces of the purpose of a risk assessment, the outline of a risk assessment, some practical applications and guardrails. I think you hit it all on the head. You know, as I alluded to, obviously there's a lot more to talk about in this topic. I think there's a lot of practical examples that we could discuss and create along the way. I know we focused a little bit on the residual bone just because that's such a common issue in the average sterile processing department. But I know if you're a leader in a department, you may be sitting there looking around thinking, oh man, I could do 20, 30, 40 risk assessments right now on different potential risk. You may be feeling that kind of pressing, overwhelming feeling of, I can't do them all. But don't let that paralyze you into inaction. You know, the purpose of this talk is not to put another thing on your plate that maybe you're not doing today that you need to start doing right away. It is critical. They are helpful, but I get it. There's a lot of things to do. You're pulled in a million places as a department leader, so I don't want you to feel drained and pressured after this episode. I want you to feel empowered with another piece of the tool set that you need to drive your department forward in a way that it can and that it should be. And I think if you can take what you gleaned today, and I'm going to try to create an example risk assessment. There may even be some out there that I can download and attach to the comments in this episode, just to give you some kind of tool to take to your department, to your leadership team and say, okay, guys, let's try this. Let's just pick maybe a simple problem, do a simple risk assessment. Doesn't need to be big and complex and overwhelming at the first, but just go through the process, get comfortable with it, and then begin building up to those more complex risks in your workflow to start making progress over time. All right. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. I'm going to try to cover on the next episode this idea of incident reporting in sterile processing in the OR. So it's like error reporting or issue reporting or quality reporting, whatever you want to call it. But it's a really interesting conversation there for what gets reported, what doesn't get reported, why doesn't it get reported, how do we function if we've got these massive gaps in incident data? Is it as bad as we think it is? Maybe it's not as bad. Who knows, because we don't have the data if we don't have the reporting. And so we're going to dive in to the dynamics around that, posing some interesting questions, maybe get you thinking creatively about how you can increase your reporting rates. That way your data goes up and then you've got more tangible resources to make better decisions as a sterile processing team. So hang in there for the next episode on that topic. Before we wrap, I want to thank you again. I know the flow of these conversations are not as natural as the human conversations. I get it. That's part of the trade-off in this kind of disruptive experiment that we're taking part here. It's a computer plus AI. No, it's not computer plus AI. It's a human plus AI. I'm not even smooth as the human, so combining me with the choppy AI, I'm sure, is even more interesting. But We're making history, y'all. This is a part of something big. It seems weird and awkward and not smooth right now, but I'm telling you, in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to look back and be like, man, that's where it started. That's where we began understanding how powerful of an educational sidekick AI can be, specific to our sterile processing problems and issues and data. I mean, it's massive. So I want to thank you, especially you early adopters. You guys are just like, I'm going to push through the awkwardness. I'm going to tune in anyways. The quality is good enough, choppy at times, but I'm going to push through it because I'm hungry to see what the implications are and what the opportunities are. And I think every episode that you're tuning in for, you're starting to see a smaller part of the big picture and the potential here of, man, if you latch onto this early as a sterile processing leader or innovator or tech, you're going to be ahead of the curve. All right. So thanks for tuning in. And as we tell you each and every week here at Beyond Clean, until we talk to you again, keep fighting dirty.